"The East Wing accounts are 3 months behind," said the gentleman in the gray waistcoat, and then he walked away, as though the observation itself were a sufficient task for anyone who happened to hear it. Beatrice Ashworth heard it. She picked up her pen. The ballroom of Harcastle Park glittered with the particular ferocity of a household determined to prove it had nothing to prove. 4 dozen candles burned in each of the 3 chandeliers, and the assembled guests of the Viscount Pembury's winter gathering moved beneath them in patterns that had been rehearsed over decades of identical evenings. The right names in conversation with the right names, the right gowns in proximity to the right invitations, the right smiles calibrated to the precise temperature required. Somewhere near the long windows, a string quartet performed a Haydn piece that nobody was listening to. The footmen had been instructed to pour generously. The flowers, Beatrice had arranged them herself that afternoon. 114 white roses, distributed across 11 vases at precise intervals along the east and north walls, were being admired without being noticed, which was precisely how the best arrangements worked. And at the edge of all that calculated magnificence, seated at a small writing desk that had been moved into the corner near the service corridor, working through a column of figures by the light of a single candle she had brought from the housekeeper's room, was Beatrice. She wore her gray dress. She had worn it to the last 2 gatherings, and she would wear it to the next one, and no one who mattered in that room would remember what she was wearing, because no one who mattered in that room would remember she was there. She was 23, and she had been the Viscount Pembury's household manager, without the title, without the salary that title implied, and without any particular expectation that this would change, for 4 years and 7 months. The gray dress was appropriate to her situation. It was also the only dress she owned that had not been remade from something else. She was adding the footman's quarterly wages against the wine account when she heard the room change. It did not change loudly. The music continued. The conversations continued. But there was a current shift, the way a room full of candles will all tilt in the same direction when a door opens, and Beatrice looked up from her figures before she could stop herself. The Duke of Merwick had arrived. He was not what she had expected, though she had not expected anything in particular, because she had not been expecting to notice him at all. He was tall, dark-coated, and he moved through the admiring edge of the crowd with the precise efficiency of someone completing a necessary obligation. No performance of it. He did not pause to receive compliments. He spoke briefly to Viscount Pembury at the entrance, accepted a glass he did not drink from, and then turned to survey the room with the steady, methodical attention of someone reading a document. His gaze passed across the string quartet, across the women arranged near the north windows, across the groups of men near the fireplace, across the vases of white roses along the east wall, and Beatrice had the odd, brief sensation that he had actually counted them. Then his gaze continued and reached the corner desk. He did not look at her the way the other guests looked at her when they happened to look at her at all, which was with the brief and easily resolved puzzlement of a man who has noticed an unfamiliar piece of furniture. The Duke of Merwick looked at her the way a man looks at a thing he intends to understand. It was not a comfortable feeling. It was not an uncomfortable one. It was simply precise, and it lasted exactly long enough to feel deliberate before he looked away. Beatrice returned to her accounts. The East Wing was, in fact, 4 months behind, not 3. She noted this in the margin, underlined it, and continued. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like recognition. She had been 14 when her father died. He had been a man of modest means and immodest character, enthusiastic about horses, indifferent to ledgers, genuinely warm toward his daughter in the way of men who love their children without having any particular theory about what children need. When he died, what he left behind was a small estate in Hertfordshire, a quantity of debt that could charitably be described as significant, and Beatrice, who discovered the debt before anyone else did, because she had always been the one who knew where things were kept. Her uncle, Gerald Ashworth, arrived within the week. He was her father's younger brother, a man with a solicitor's mind and a merchant's instincts, and he looked at the estate, looked at the debt, looked at Beatrice, and arrived at a comprehensive solution to all 3. He would manage the estate. He would manage the creditors. Beatrice would manage the household, help him understand the existing accounts, and be available for whatever else required attending to. He did not say she would be paid. She understood, at 14, that asking would accomplish nothing. She picked up the account books, and she sat down at the desk that had been her father's, and she began. She was not a clever girl, her uncle told guests occasionally, but she was useful. She heard him say it once, and wrote it down in the margin of a creditor letter she was drafting that evening, next to the figure for the quarterly interest. She wrote it down so that she would remember that she had heard it and had decided it was wrong, and that she had chosen not to become smaller because someone whose judgment she did not trust had offered her a smaller shape to inhabit. She managed the estate for 4 years. Not the social management, not the governance, the real management, which is another category of work entirely. She negotiated with the wool merchant who came twice yearly to dispute the clip weight, and she always won because she had measured the clip herself and written down the figures before he arrived. She renegotiated the terms on her father's outstanding loan with the grain merchant in the 2nd year, reducing the interest by 1/3 by presenting 3 years of comparable local rates that she had compiled from conversations with neighboring farm stewards, none of whom had known they were providing financial intelligence. She mapped every tenant farm's rent history for the preceding decade and identified that 3 of the 12 were underpaying relative to the acreage by a total of £62 annually, not from dishonesty, but from an old informal agreement her father had made and then forgotten to document, which meant the tenants were operating on a different set of accounts than the estate. She corrected this without conflict by writing formal letters that established the new terms while acknowledging the history, and the tenants, who had been braced for hostility, responded with something close to relief. None of this was credited to her. Her uncle presented the estate's improving accounts to his acquaintances as the natural result of sound management. He was not precisely lying, he was the manager. It simply was not his management producing the results, and he knew that, and said nothing, and Beatrice continued to know it, and also said nothing, because she was 18 and had nowhere to go. She had almost broken once. It was a February, the 3rd year, and she had spent 6 days without proper sleep, negotiating a creditor dispute that her uncle had mishandled, and then handed to her to repair. And on the 6th day, she had sat down in the chair in the estate office at 5:30 in the morning, when the fire had gone out, and thought, with absolute clarity, that she could not continue to do this. She sat with that thought for perhaps 3 minutes. Then she got up, rebuilt the fire, and returned to the creditor letter. She had not broken. She had simply decided, at 18 and in a cold office in February, that she was not going to become less than she was, because the world preferred its women smaller. She came to Viscount Pembury's household at 19, after her uncle remarried, and his new wife required a different domestic arrangement. The Viscountess wanted a companion secretary who would be presentable enough for occasional company and invisible enough for daily life. Beatrice was both. She came with no wages specified and no contract written. These things were arranged through her uncle's correspondence with the Viscount's solicitor, and Beatrice was not consulted, because it did not occur to the men involved that consulting her was a necessary component of the arrangement. She arrived with a trunk, her father's complete account ledgers from the estate, which she had copied by hand before leaving, because they were technically the estate's property, and she wanted the knowledge, and a clear understanding that she was beginning again, at 19, in the same position she had occupied at 14. She noted the date in her own ledger, 19 years old, household manager, undesignated, salary, none confirmed. She underlined it, added a question mark, and then beside the question mark she wrote, "To be resolved." It took her 8 months to establish a de facto salary, which she did by the simple method of becoming indispensable so quickly that when she presented the Viscountess with a written list of her responsibilities alongside comparable wages for each function in formal household positions, the Viscountess had no good basis for refusal. The salary she received was still less than any properly titled housekeeper would have commanded. It was £12 per year, more than nothing, and Beatrice accepted it, marked it in her ledger, and continued. In 4 years and 7 months she had drafted the household's new supplier agreements, renegotiated the coal contract twice, redesigned the kitchen rotation schedule to reduce the cook's wastage costs by £14 annually, corrected an accounting error in the estate's wine merchant relationship that had been overpaying by £8 per quarter for at least 3 years, and arranged a total of 31 social gatherings without a single logistical failure, including the midsummer ball of 2 years past, which had been attended by 412 guests, and had required the management of 17 outside caterers, 11 hired musicians, and a set of table arrangements that the Viscountess changed twice in the final 48 hours. No one outside the service wing knew her name. She was doing the East Wing accounts at the corner desk when the Duke of Merwick arrived, and she had not looked up from them since that single, deliberate glance. But she was aware of where he stood in the room, in the way she was always aware of things happening on the periphery of her attention. Not because he was a duke, but because he was still doing it. He was still looking at things with that methodical particular attention, and methodical particular attention was rare enough in a room full of performances that it registered. She did not look up again. She returned to her column of figures, and the column of figures told her the East Wing was short by £43 in the third quarter, and she wrote a note to herself to examine the supplier's invoices in the morning. And then the quartet finished their piece, and there was a swell of conversation, and someone near the service corridor said, too loudly, "I was not aware Pembury kept secretaries in his ballroom," and laughed at their own observation. Beatrice did not look up. She picked up her pen and continued. The Duke of Merwick left Harcastle Park the following morning before the household was fully awake, which was how Beatrice knew he had spoken to someone on the staff the previous evening, because the footman on the East Corridor reported it to her at 7 o'clock, when she was reviewing the breakfast orders. He had asked, apparently, for the name of the woman at the corner desk. He had been told she was the household manager. He had asked how long she had been in the post. He had thanked the footman and gone to bed. Beatrice noted this in the margin of her morning list, then crossed it out, then thought about why she had crossed it out, and could not produce a satisfying reason, so she moved on to the breakfast orders. She heard later from the Viscountess that the Duke of Merwick was recently returned to England after 2 years managing his ducal estates in the north, that he was considered the most eligible unattached peer in 3 counties, and that Lady Annalise Fortescue, eldest daughter of the Earl of Dearne, had been broadly understood for some time to be the appropriate conclusion to that particular situation. The Viscountess reported this last item with a specific weight, that Beatrice understood was meant as instruction. Lady Annalise had been present at the gathering, beautiful and precisely composed, arranged near the long windows with the particular stillness of a woman who knows she is the center of a painting. She had received the Duke's greeting with the contained pleasure of a woman who has received confirmation of something she already knew. Beatrice had not thought about the Duke of Merwick again. There had been no reason to. He was a duke, and she was the woman at the corner desk, and the distance between those two positions was not merely social, but structural, a question of law and money, and the entire machinery of a world that had decided what she was before she opened her mouth. She was not bitter about this. Bitterness was a form of attention she could not afford. She had accounts to manage. The second time she encountered Everard Cavenmore, Duke of Merwick, she was in the Pembury Estates library at 11 o'clock at night, 3 weeks after the winter gathering, and she was not expecting anyone. She had come for the household accounts from 4 years previous, which she needed to verify a discrepancy in the current coal contract, and she had her candle and her list, and no particular thought about anything except the third quarter invoices. The library was dark, except for her candle and the low fire that the footman had neglected to bank properly, and she was climbing the small library ladder to reach the account shelf when she heard the door open below her. She did not startle. She turned on the ladder with the care appropriate to being 6 feet above the floor, and looked down, and the Duke of Merwick was standing in the doorway with his coat on and his hat in his hand, which meant he had just arrived, or was just leaving, and neither of those options explained why he was in the Pembury library. "I was told," he said, looking up at her with that same methodical directness, "that Viscount Pembury keeps his estate records in this room. I have an investment agreement with him from 2 years past that requires reviewing." He paused. "You are the household manager." "I am," said Beatrice, from the ladder. "The estate records are behind you, on the lower shelves. The household accounts, which are what I am here for, are directly above me." He turned, identified the lower shelves, and began looking. Beatrice climbed the final 2 rungs, found the correct ledger, and descended. She was back on the floor with the account book before he found what he was looking for, and she noted this without comment. "This agreement," he said, without turning around, "references a clause that revised the return structure for the North Pasture development. I cannot locate the corresponding revision." Beatrice set her ledger on the reading table. There was a codicil letter sent in November of that year. It would be filed with the solicitor's correspondence rather than with the primary agreements. "The Viscount keeps his solicitor's correspondence in the morning room, in the green chest beneath the window. He turned and looked at her then. It was the same look as before, the measuring, particular attention, but something in it had shifted slightly. You know the location of the Viscount's solicitor's correspondence. I manage the correspondence routing, said Beatrice. I know where everything is. He set the folder down. That is a significant responsibility. It is an undesignated one, she said, and opened her account ledger, because she was not going to stand in the library at 11 o'clock, discussing the terms of her employment with a stranger, even a stranger who happened to be a duke. He did not leave. He stood for a moment, and then he crossed to the reading table and sat down on the other side of it, which was unexpected, and opened the folder he had been carrying. He worked through its contents with the same focused efficiency she had seen the night of the gathering. She worked through her coal invoices. The fire burned low between them. Neither of them spoke for approximately 20 minutes, and the silence was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind that forms between two people who are both too occupied to perform an ease they do not feel. There is a discrepancy here, he said finally. He was looking at his agreement. How much? Said Beatrice, without looking up from her invoices. £11, 6 pence. The clause as written would return £11 and 6 pence less per quarter than the verbal terms of the agreement, as I understood them. She looked up. Whose hand drafted the clause? He looked at the document, the Viscount's solicitor. Then I would suggest, said Beatrice, that you request the draft correspondence for that specific clause before you raise the discrepancy with the Viscount. If the discrepancy is in the drafting, the solicitor will acknowledge it more readily than the Viscount will. If the discrepancy is in your recollection of the verbal terms, the draft correspondence will tell you that too. He looked at her across the reading table. Not the measuring look this time. Something quieter and more direct. You know how to negotiate documents, he said. I know how to read them, she said. And I know that most disputes are about the distance between what was said and what was written, and that the draft correspondence is usually the shortest path between those two things. She returned to her invoices. He sat with this for a moment. Then he said, I have been looking for a steward for Cavenmore House. The previous steward retired 14 months ago, and I have not found a satisfactory replacement. Beatrice finished her notation and closed her ledger. Good evening, Your Grace, she said, and took her candle and left. She did not run. She walked, at her ordinary pace, back to her room, and sat down at her own small desk, and opened her personal ledger to the page where she had been keeping her own accounts, the ones that did not belong to anyone else. She had £47 saved. She had been saving for 3 years. She had a particular idea about those £47 that she had not fully articulated yet, but which had to do with being the one who held the contract rather than the one who was named in it. She wrote the date in the margin. Below it she wrote, he noticed the discrepancy, £11, 6 pence. Then she closed the ledger and went to bed. He came back. She had not expected him to come back, but 3 days later, the Viscount's footman delivered a note to the morning room where she was reviewing the linen inventory. And the note was from Everard Cavenmore, Duke of Merwick, and it said, I would be grateful if you would review a contract clause for me at your convenience. I have the draft correspondence you suggested. It said convenience, which no one had ever said to her in writing before. It said grateful. She read it twice, then folded it and put it in her apron pocket, and continued with the linen inventory, and finished, and then went to find the Viscount to ask whether she might be absent for an afternoon. She had hired a private investigator. This was not information Beatrice had, and would not have. She did not know that Everard had, within 48 hours of the winter gathering at Harcastle Park, sent a letter to a man in London who specialized in the quiet, thorough assessment of persons and situations that his clients needed to understand before acting. She did not know that the report had come back in 10 days, and that it had been 8 pages, and that it had listed the following: her father's name and the circumstances of his death, her uncle's management of the estate, and the terms by which she had come to the Pemberys, the salary she had negotiated, the complete list of contracts she had revised, renegotiated, or originated during her tenure, the coal contract saving, the wine merchant correction, the 31 social gatherings managed without incident, the £47 in her savings account, which the investigator had found through the local banking agent's records. She did not know that at the bottom of the 8-page report, in his own hand, the investigator had added, "She is, in this examiner's judgment, the most operationally capable person he has surveyed in 11 years of practice. Against a population of approximately 400 subjects, the majority of them men in senior estate positions. She did not know that Everard had read this report twice, then folded it and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, where he had kept it since. He had a wound, and it was not the kind that could be pointed to. It was the kind that had built up over 14 years of managing something enormous, alone. His mother had died when he was 21, and she had been the person who understood Cavenmore House as a living thing, rather than an administrative problem, who had known the names of the tenant children, who had kept the household accounts in her own precise hand, who had played the pianoforte in the east drawing room on Sunday evenings, with an accuracy that the house seemed to remember in her absence. He had been 21 and wholly unprepared, and he had managed the dukedom through force of will and competence, and no one had ever suggested that force of will and competence, applied continuously, for 14 years, without a person beside you who understood the actual texture of the work, might accumulate into something that felt like permanent exhaustion. He did not perform this wound, he did not discuss it. He made his decisions and held them and moved through the world with the contained precision of a man who has long since learned that the world responds better to what you do than to what you feel. He had come to the Pembury gathering because of the investment agreement, and he had looked at the room because he always looked at rooms, and he had seen the corner desk and the woman at it, and something had registered with the specificity of a note played in the right key after a long performance of notes played slightly wrong. He had not understood it immediately. He had asked for her name, and then he had asked for the report, and then he had read the report, and then he had understood. He had gone back to the library because she was there, and he had known she was there, and he had come in with the investment agreement as a reason, which was partially true. The clause discrepancy was real. He had simply known, walking through the Pembury library door at 11 o'clock, that the solution to the clause discrepancy was also real, and that the solution was her. He had stood outside the morning room door the previous afternoon for 6 minutes before knocking to deliver the note himself, which he did not need to do. He could have given it to a footman. He stood there for 6 minutes, and then he knocked, and the footman answered and told him Miss Ashworth was not available, and he gave the footman the note and walked back to his carriage with the particular feeling of a man who has been more visible than he intended. She came on Wednesday afternoon. She brought a notebook. She arrived at Cavenmore House because he had asked to meet there, explaining that the relevant documents were in the estate office, by hired carriage, with her notebook and her pen, and the very clear understanding that she was doing a professional service for a duke she did not know, and that was the complete extent of the situation. She was shown to the estate office by his housekeeper, a small, brisk woman named Mrs. Mallory, who looked her over, with frank assessment, and offered her tea without ceremony, which Beatrice accepted gratefully. He was already in the estate office when she arrived. The relevant documents were spread across the desk: the investment agreement, the draft correspondence, 3 supporting letters, and a handwritten notation that appeared to be his own summary of the timeline. She noted the notation and noted that it was accurate and organized, and sat down across from him and opened her notebook. The clause was, as she had suspected, a drafting error. The draft correspondence clearly showed the verbal terms, a 12% return structure on the North Pasture development, and the executed agreement had been drafted at 10.5%, which was the standard structure for a different type of investment entirely, and which had likely been copied in error from a template. The discrepancy was £11.06 per quarter, which over the 3 remaining years of the agreement was a total of £138. "This is straightforward," she said. "The draft correspondence is unambiguous. You present this to the solicitor with a formal letter requesting correction, and you name the figure, £138 total over the remaining term. If they push back, you note that the corrected rate is documented in the original draft and request an explanation for the variance. They will not push back. You are certain," he said. "A solicitor who knows he made a drafting error will always prefer a quiet correction to a formal dispute," she said. "The correction costs him nothing except acknowledgement. The dispute costs him his reputation. He will choose acknowledgement." She wrote the suggested letter's opening paragraph in her notebook, tore out the page, and handed it across the desk. "Use this as the beginning. The rest is your own wording." He took the page and read it. Then he set it down and looked at her with that quiet, particular attention. "You wrote this in under a minute," he said. "I have drafted a significant number of such letters," she said, and closed her notebook. He did not dismiss her. He sat back in his chair. He had removed his coat at some point, she noticed, and was in his shirt sleeves and waistcoat, which was not the posture of a man performing a formal consultation. And he said, "I would like you to look at something else, if you are willing." She was willing, though she did not say so immediately. She looked at him for a moment, with the specific attention she applied to things she was not yet sure about, and then she said, "What is it?" He slid a second folder across the desk. It was the estate accounts for Cavenmore House, 3 years of them, organized by quarter. "I have managed these myself since my steward retired," he said. "I believe they are sound. I would appreciate a second assessment." Beatrice opened the folder. She began reading. She was aware, at a level below the level where she was reading, that Everard Cavenmore was watching her read, and that this was different from being watched, the way most people watched her, which was not at all. She set this awareness aside and focused on the accounts. They were sound, more than sound. They were meticulous and accurate and organized in a manner that indicated genuine comprehension of the estate's financial mechanics, rather than merely competent record-keeping. But there was one item in the second year's third quarter that pulled her attention like a hook. She went back to it. "This entry," she said, pointing. "The repairs to the east drainage in the second year. What about it? The invoice total is correct, but the entry in the following quarter shows no corresponding cost for the supplier's follow-up inspection, which was a standard clause in drainage contracts of this type during this period. Either the clause was waived, or the inspection was completed and not billed, which would be unusual." He looked where she was pointing. "The clause was waived," he said. "The supplier was a local firm, and I knew the proprietor. He agreed to waive the inspection fee in exchange for a preferred supplier agreement on the following year's work." "Then that should be documented here," she said, as a note to the entry, referencing the supplier agreement. "Without documentation, the apparent absence looks like either an oversight or an unrecorded payment, and either of those creates a question in the accounts that cannot be answered by the numbers alone." He was quiet for a moment. "You are right," he said. It was direct and unqualified, which was unusual. Most men, in her experience, required several more minutes before arriving at that sentence, and usually arrived there via a more scenic route. She noted the omission in her notebook with the relevant quarter's reference numbers, and then she looked up and found that he was still watching her, and that his expression had shifted to something she could not immediately catalog. It was not the measuring look, and it was not the directness of a man conducting a professional consultation. It was something quieter and more considered, and it looked, very much, like the expression of a person who has been waiting for a long time and has only just identified what they were waiting for. She returned to the accounts. She was at this for another 40 minutes, working through the third year with the methodical focus she brought to everything, and he sat across from her and worked through his own papers and said nothing, and the estate office was comfortable in the way that a room becomes comfortable when the people in it are not pretending to be anything they are not. When she finished, she made a list of 7 notes, minor items, each with a specific recommendation, and set it on the desk between them. "These are small," she said. "The accounts are well kept. The primary recommendation is the documentation practice, notes to entries where informal agreements affect the figures." He looked at the list. Then he said, without looking up, "Your cravat is on crooked." She said, "I do not wear a cravat." "Mine," he said, and looked up, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was in that direction. "I was not pointing out yours." She looked at his cravat. It was, in fact, slightly off-center. "It has been like that since I arrived," she said. "I know," he said. He had been at his desk since 7 in the morning and had not thought about it. He was thinking about it now, for reasons he did not examine. She stood, walked around the desk, and straightened it. Her hands were quick and practiced, and she stepped back immediately. It was 3 seconds, and she was already returning to her side of the desk before she registered that she had done it. He said nothing. He looked at her with that quiet, considered expression, and she sat down and gathered her notebook, and then he said, "Would you be willing to assess the household management structure as well? The accounts are the estate accounts. The household is a different question, and I believe it is where the inefficiencies, if there are any, actually live." She had managed to her feet. She sat back down. How many rooms occupied regularly? She said. 14, 11 staff. The housekeeper is sound. The rest is less organized than I would like. What is the cook's annual budget against actual expenditure? I don't know, he said. Then that is where to start, she said, and opened her notebook again. She was there for another 2 hours. By the time Mrs. Mallory knocked to ask about dinner, there was an awkward pause at this point, during which both Beatrice and the Duke of Merwick appeared to realize simultaneously that the consultation had extended past any ordinary afternoon appointment. Beatrice had a 12-item preliminary assessment of the Cavenmore household management structure, including 3 specific cost recoveries she could identify without seeing the full invoices, totaling approximately £60 annually, and Everard had offered, twice, to send a carriage for her if she would be willing to return on Thursday. She accepted the carriage. She was not sure she should have, but she accepted it, because the work was interesting and because she was not going to pretend otherwise when she was alone with herself and a ledger. She saw Mrs. Mallory watching her as she left, and Mrs. Mallory was not watching her the way staff usually watched an outsider in their employer's household, with that particular mixture of suspicion and territorial wariness. She was watching her the way a person watches someone they have already decided to trust, which was enough of a surprise that Beatrice nearly missed the front step. Thursday came, then the following Monday, then Thursday again. The household management assessment became a full audit of Cavenmore House's supplier relationships, which became an annotated review of the estate steward's ledgers going back 6 years, which became the most demanding and interesting work Beatrice had done since the creditor negotiations in Hertfordshire, which had been 5 years ago, and which she still sometimes thought about in moments of professional nostalgia. She was aware of what was happening. Not the assessment. That was obvious. The other thing. He came to find her in the garden on the second Thursday, where she had taken the estate maps to cross-reference the tenant boundaries against the rental records. He sat beside her on the low stone wall, without asking if she minded, and looked at the map she was holding. She showed him the discrepancy she had found, a boundary adjustment from 11 years ago that had not been reflected in the corresponding rent calculations, which meant 2 of the 12 tenant farms had been paying marginally incorrect rent for over a decade. He looked at this for a long moment. That is an error I made, he said, or rather, that I inherited and did not catch. You inherited a great deal that required catching, she said. She was looking at the map, not at him, and she said it without softness and without accusation, which was precisely why it landed the way it did, as a simple statement of fact from someone who had looked at the evidence and reached a conclusion. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, My mother managed this estate's household until her death. She understood it in a way that I have not been able to replicate. What did she do that you haven't been able to replicate? Said Beatrice. She knew everyone, he said. Every tenant's name, every child's name. She kept them in a book. I have the book, and I cannot read it the way she read it. I can see the names, but she knew what was behind them. Beatrice folded the estate map and set it on the wall between them. You could update the book, she said. Have someone ride the tenant farms. Not to assess, just to visit. To ask how the winter went. The names have changed. There will be children she doesn't have listed, and tenants who have moved on. You could have a current book. He looked at her. You make it sound very simple. Most things are, she said. The difficulty is usually in deciding to begin. He did not say anything. He simply sat there on the wall with the spring light coming in at an angle across the garden, and Beatrice picked up the map again, and they stayed there together for another 20 minutes, while she finished the boundary analysis, and neither of them said anything about what was happening, because neither of them had said it yet, but it was there in the garden between them, like a structure being built, not quick, not dramatic, each piece placed by someone who intended it to hold. She played his mother's composition. She had found it in the music room, a handwritten piece among the sheet music on the pianoforte, in a hand different from the printed scores around it, the paper more aged. She had asked Mrs. Mallory who had written it, and Mrs. Mallory had told her the Duchess, the old Duchess, before she passed. She should not have played it. She had simply sat down at the pianoforte on a Tuesday afternoon, when she was waiting for the cook to return with the supplier ledgers, and she had seen the piece, and she had played it, because she could read music and the piece was there, and she had not thought far enough ahead. He was in the doorway when she finished. She had not heard him come in. She sat at the pianoforte with her hands still on the keys, and looked at him standing in the doorway, and he was not wearing his usual contained expression. He was wearing the expression of a man who has heard something he had thought was gone. "I'm sorry," she said immediately. "I should not have played it without asking." "No," he said, and it came out low and without inflection. "Don't apologize for that. Please." She moved to stand, and he crossed the room in 3 strides and sat down on the bench beside her, and said, "Play it again," he said, it the way a man says something he has wanted to say for 14 years and has only just found the occasion. She played it again. He sat beside her on the bench, and did not speak, and did not move, and when she finished the second time, she set her hands in her lap and waited. "She played it every Sunday," he said, "in this room. She had a good ear for harmony," said Beatrice. "The middle section is more complex than it appears on the page." He looked at her hands on the keys, and then he looked up at her face, and they were sitting very close on the narrow bench, and Beatrice became aware all at once that this was the closest they had been to each other in any of the mornings and afternoons and one evening in the garden that had accumulated into the present moment. "Beatrice," he said. She said, "I know," because she did. She knew what was coming, and she knew what her answer should be for all the reasonable structural reasons of the world, and she knew that she had not decided what her actual answer was, and she was not going to decide in a music room on a piano bench before she had thought it through. She stood and straightened her gray dress and said, "The cook should be back with the ledgers. I'll let you know what I find." He did not try to stop her. He sat at the piano bench and watched her go, and she felt his gaze on her back all the way to the door, and she pressed one hand briefly against the door frame as she passed through it, which was not something she had planned to do. She had managed 31 social gatherings without a failure. She could manage this. The Earl of Durn arrived at Cavenmore House on the following Tuesday. He had not been invited, or rather, he had invited himself in the manner of men who do not distinguish between invitation and announcement, and he arrived with his daughter, in a manner that indicated he considered the visit both natural and overdue. Lady Annalise Fortescue was exactly as beautiful as Beatrice had assessed at the winter gathering, precise, composed, arranged with the particular care of someone who understands that presentation is a form of argument. She wore a morning dress of pale blue that was worth more than Beatrice's annual salary, and she moved through the Cavenmore drawing room with the familiar ease of someone who has been rehearsing this eventual ownership for years. Beatrice was in the estate office when they arrived, and she was introduced to them, briefly, by Mrs. Mallory in the corridor, as the household assessor. Lady Annalise looked at her with a gaze that was not unkind and not curious, but simply resolved, the way one looks at a piece of furniture that one expects to rearrange. The Earl of Durn was not unkind either. He was something more specific. He was a man of genuine conviction that the world worked in a particular way for principled reasons, and that those reasons applied to Everard Cavenmore and a suitable duchess no less than they applied to anything else. He had been, Beatrice gathered from the portions of the drawing-room conversation that traveled to the estate office through the open window, a friend of the late Duke's. He spoke of the family with the authority of long connection. He spoke of the dukedom's requirements with the gravity of a man who considers himself its caretaker. She overheard him say at one point, "You cannot manage Cavenmore on professional relationships, Merwick. You need a mistress of the house, not a hired consultant." She did not stop working. She noted the third-quarter drainage invoice, cross-referenced it against the preferred supplier agreement, and added a documentation note to the estate record. Then she gathered the completed audit summary, 23 pages, annotated, with specific recommended actions numbered and costed, and walked to the drawing room. She knocked and entered. There were 4 people in the room: Everard, the Earl, Lady Annalise, and the Earl's secretary. They all turned. "I have completed the preliminary audit," she said to Everard, without addressing the room at large. She set the 23 pages on the side table near the door. "The summary is on page 1. The specific recommendations are on pages 2 through 8. The supporting evidence for each recommendation is in the appendices. The total identified cost recovery, if all recommendations are implemented, is £214 annually. The most significant single item is the coal contract renegotiation, which I have flagged as priority 1 because the current contract expires in 6 weeks." The room was quiet. The Earl of Durn looked at the document. He looked at Everard. He looked at Beatrice. £214, said the Earl. "Annually," said Beatrice. The coal contract alone accounts for 78. The full calculations are in Appendix C. She did not look at Lady Annalise. She looked at the Earl, because he was the one who had expressed the opinion about professional relationships, and she thought he was entitled to the full professional context. Everard said, quietly, "Thank you, Beatrice." She said, "Of course," and left. She did not run. She walked back to the estate office and sat down at the desk and opened her notebook and went back to work, because the coal contract was not going to write itself. She heard, later, from Mrs. Mallory, that the Earl had spent a considerable time on page 1 of the audit summary, that he had turned to page 3, that he had not said anything for a while. She was not there when it happened. She was in the estate office when Everard came to find her at 4:30, after the Earl and Lady Annalise had departed. He came in without knocking. He had stopped knocking 3 weeks ago, which she had noticed and not addressed, and stood in the doorway in his shirt sleeves with his hair slightly disordered, which indicated he had been running his hand through it, which indicated the afternoon had been difficult. "He is not wrong," said Everard, "about the dukedom requiring a mistress of the house." Beatrice looked up from the coal contract draft. "I know," she said. "I want to ask you something." "Then ask it," she said. "Will you consider it formally?" he said. "An engagement. The situation requires—" He stopped. He looked at her with that quiet, considered expression. "This is not how I intended to say this." "I know," she said again. She closed the coal contract draft and looked at him fully. She thought about it, not briefly, not performatively, but actually thought about it the way she thought about everything, what it meant, what it cost, what it built. She thought about the £47 in her savings account and what she had intended them for. She thought about the music room and the piano bench and his voice saying her name. She thought about the 23-page audit and what it meant that he had read it without flinching. She thought about her gray dress and the corner desk at Harcastle Park and the footman's report that he had asked for her name. "All right," she said, "but I want the coal contract managed properly first." He looked at her for a moment, and then that corner of his mouth moved into the thing that was definitively a smile, and he said, "The coal contract will be managed properly." She nodded and opened the draft again. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, and they worked through it together until the light failed. The formal announcement was made 3 days later at a small dinner the Viscount Pembury held in his capacity as a neighboring peer with an interest in the matter. Everard stood before 12 witnesses and announced his intention to marry Miss Beatrice Ashworth, and the room received this in the way that rooms receive information that reorganizes itself slowly rather than all at once. Lady Annalise was not present. The Earl of Durn was, and he sat very still through the announcement with the particular expression of a man who is reassessing an equation he had believed was complete. He did not leave immediately. He sat through dinner, and he was quiet, and after dinner, he said one thing to Beatrice, privately, in the corridor near the dining room door. He said, "I should like to see the full audit, if you are willing to share it." "Appendix C first," she said. "The coal contract numbers are the most immediate." He nodded. He walked away. He did not apologize, and she had not expected him to, and what he had offered was, in its way, more useful. 3 days before the hearing, because there was, in the end, a hearing, before the Ducal Estates Board of Managing Trustees, 4 men who had opinions about the suitability of the Duke's intended, and who had the legal standing to make those opinions inconvenient. Beatrice sat in the Cavenmore estate office at 7 in the morning and organized her materials. She had 23 pages of audit summary. She had the coal contract revision, signed and dated 2 days before the current contract's expiry, which had resulted in an immediate saving of £78 on the annual figure. She had the tenant farm boundary corrections, documented and acknowledged by the relevant tenants. She had the annotated estate ledgers from the past 6 years, with her own notations in a different color ink so that her work was distinguishable from the original record. She had a letter from the Pembury household solicitor, obtained with the Viscountess's permission, attesting to the management of 31 social gatherings. She had her personal savings ledger, showing £47 entered over 3 years, because she had decided that her financial competence was a relevant document. She had not slept very well. She straightened her spine and continued. The board met in the Cavenmore Formal Library, which was a large, dark-paneled room that had been designed to make whatever happened in it feel consequential. 4 trustees, all men of senior years, arranged around the head table, in the manner of men who have been doing this for a long time and expect to continue doing it. Everard sat at the side. Beatrice was placed in a chair at the front of the room, which was the position that felt most like being in a dock, and she sat in it with her materials on the table before her, and her hands folded and her face composed. The lead trustee, a man named Gareth Aldridge, who had the manner of someone who has won a great many arguments by beginning with a tone of settled certainty, opened by explaining that the board was not opposed to the Duke's happiness, but had a responsibility to the dukedom's long-term stability, which required them to assess whether the proposed match was consistent with Cavenmore's institutional requirements. He looked at Beatrice over his reading glasses. Beatrice said, "I understand. I have prepared materials that address the question of what I would bring to this institution. Perhaps we could begin there." She did not argue about whether the question was fair. She presented. She walked them through the audit summary, 23 pages, organized by section, each recommendation specific and costed. She walked them through the coal contract revision, showing the terms she had negotiated and the comparable market rates she had researched. She showed the tenant farm boundary corrections and explained the methodology she had used to identify them. She showed the 6-year ledger annotations and explained, without heat, that the previous steward had been competent but had missed 3 recurring patterns in the supplier invoices that she had documented in detail. She showed the Pembury letter. She showed her savings ledger. The room did not erupt when she finished. There was a long, suspended moment in which the 4 trustees looked at what was in front of them, and Gareth Aldridge looked at the coal contract revision with the expression of a man who had expected to be unimpressed and is having to revise this expectation in real time. Everard stood up. He did not stand up to speak, precisely. He stood up and walked to the front of the room and stood beside Beatrice's chair, and he said, to the Board of Trustees, in the level, contained voice of a man who has made his decision and holds it, "I want to be clear about why I am here. I am not here because this is convenient or appropriate, or because Miss Ashworth fits a category of suitability that you will find in any document. I am here because she is the most capable person I have encountered in 14 years of managing this estate alone, and because I am not willing to continue alone when she has been willing to be here." He paused. "The decision is mine, and it is made. What you are reviewing today is not whether to permit the match. It is whether you understand what is being brought to this house. I hope the materials have clarified that." He did not kneel. He extended his hand to her, in front of the 4 trustees, and the family solicitor, and the man from the ducal land office who had been invited as an observer, and he held it there until she placed her hand in his. He looked at the room and then at her, and the look was the private one, the quiet, considered expression from the music room and the garden wall, placed in front of witnesses, because she deserved to have witnesses. Aldridge looked at the coal contract a moment longer. Then he set it down and said, with the particular gruffness of a man who has been moved against his will, "The appendices are thorough." Beatrice said, "Thank you. Appendix C will continue to need attention in the 3rd year of the new contract cycle. I have noted the relevant clauses." They were married in June, at Cavenmore, in a ceremony attended by the ducal trustees, the Viscount Pembury and his household, the Earl of Derna and his daughter, who came with the gracious composure of a woman who has reordered an expectation and chosen to be present for what followed, and the entire tenant community of the estate, because Everard had sent personal letters to each of the 12 farms, and Beatrice had included a hand-drawn map so that the older tenants who had trouble with the lane directions would not get lost. Mrs. Mallory cried, efficiently and without lingering. The private proposal had come the week before, in the estate office, at 10 o'clock in the morning, between the 3rd quarter tenant summary and the preliminary coal contract review for the 2nd cycle. Everard had come in and closed the door and sat down across from her and said, "Not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you are the first person I have worked alongside who understands that the work is the love, that doing the thing carefully is the care, that fixing the account and correcting the boundary and drafting the letter is not secondary to feeling, but is the thing itself." He stopped. "I want to do the work with you, for the rest of my life, all of it." She had looked at him across the desk and thought about it completely, the way she thought about everything. She thought about the corner desk at Harcastle Park and the coal contract, and the piano bench, and the garden wall, and his voice saying her name for the first time, and the sound of him standing outside the estate office door every morning before he knocked. Yes, she said. Simple and direct, the way she said everything true. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. The years built the way sound houses build, not quickly, not dramatically, but with precision, and with attention to what the ground required. Beatrice managed Cavenmore House with the same methodical care she brought to everything, and within 3 years the estate's annual accounts had recovered a total of £304 in identified efficiencies, which she documented in an annotated ledger that the Earl of Dearn's estate manager requested permission to borrow, and which then circulated, with minor modifications, to 7 neighboring estates as a working model for household audit practice. She did not call it a system, she called it a record of work, done carefully, and she updated it every quarter. She updated the tenant book. She rode the 12 farms herself in the first autumn, with Everard beside her, and they met the children who had arrived since his mother's last entry, and the tenants who had changed, and she added every name in her own handwriting, with the date and a note beside each one, and Everard carried the book home in his coat pocket, and she found him reading it that evening, in the library, with his fingers on the pages, as though testing that it was real. She straightened his cravat at least once a week, usually on mornings when he had been in the estate office since 6 and had forgotten. He always said he had known it was crooked. She always said it had been crooked for at least 40 minutes. This was not a point of contention. Their son was born the following spring, which was the spring of their 2nd year at Cavenmore, and he was named James, after Beatrice's father, and Richard, after Everard's grandfather. And he arrived in the world with his father's methodical focus and his mother's habit of trying to reach everything that looked interesting, from wherever he happened to be, which manifested as a tendency to escape from his cradle, with a determination that was impressive for someone who could not yet walk. Their daughter arrived 2 years after James, and she was named Margaret after Everard's mother, and she was precise and warm in equal measure. And James took to her with the serious affection of a boy who has decided on a project, and Cavenmore was a house, with small feet in the corridors, and voices rising in the morning rooms, and Mrs. Mallory, navigating all of this with the efficient composure of a woman who had seen a great deal, and been surprised by very little. The dukedom's line was secure. The house was managed. The accounts were current to the week. On an evening in the 3rd autumn, Beatrice was at the writing desk in the morning room, with the quarter's tenant correspondence, when she became aware that Everard was in the doorway. He had been there for several minutes. James had escaped the nursery again and was sitting under Beatrice's desk, playing a quiet and obscure game with 2 account weights and a piece of ribbon, and Everard was watching all of it, his son under the desk, his wife at her work, the warm and specific domestic weight of the ordinary evening, with the contained, quiet expression of a man who has found the thing he had been missing for a long time and intends to hold it carefully. She did not look up. She finished the notation she was writing, set her pen down, and said, without turning, 40 minutes, at least. Longer, he said. She turned in her chair and looked at him in the doorway. Her husband, the Duke of Merwick, in his shirt sleeves, with his cravat slightly off-center, and an expression she had learned to read as clearly as any account she had ever opened. She did not cross the room. She held out her hand. He crossed it instead.